4:30 in the morning. The Arabian Sea, 200 miles south of the Iranian coast, the nuclear-powered fast-attack submarine USS Virginia sat submerged at 60 meters, her hull silent, and her reactor humming with enough power to light a small city. The order had arrived through the very low-frequency antenna 2 hours earlier, and it was a command that had never been issued in the history of the modern fleet. The question now was not whether the missiles would fly, but whether the dense air defense network surrounding Tehran would detect them before the first structural support collapsed. The deep ocean water was cold and black, pressing against the high-strength steel hull with hundreds of thousands of tons of weight. Inside the control center, the air smelled of ozone, recycled oxygen, and the sharp scent of strong coffee. Every sailor was at their station, their movements disciplined and quiet, as the ship prepared to execute a strike that would change the map of the Middle East forever. The commanding officer stood behind the seated pilots, his eyes fixed on the blue glow of the digital tactical displays. The mission was specific and absolute: the destruction of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard headquarters, located in the heart of Tehran. For decades, the building had served as the nerve center for regional operations, a fortress of concrete and high-level encryption. Within the next hour, it was scheduled to become a crater of pulverized stone and twisted rebar. In the midship section, the vertical launch system was already active. 12 Tomahawk land attack missiles sat in their canisters, their internal guidance computers receiving the final mission data. This was not a routine exercise or a demonstration of force. The coordinates were locked to a precision of less than 3 meters, targeting the specific structural nodes of the headquarters building at latitude 35 degrees 41 minutes north, longitude 51 degrees 24 minutes east. The technical team monitored the health of each missile. These were the latest Block V variants, capable of changing targets in flight, but today they were programmed for a singular, devastating purpose. The mission required the missiles to fly over 1,000 kilometers, crossing the Iranian coastline at low altitude and navigating the rugged terrain of the Zagros Mountains before descending on the capital city from the north. The executive officer stepped beside the captain, holding a digital tablet that displayed the final readiness report. Every system on the USS Virginia was functioning at peak efficiency. The sonar arrays were passive, listening for any sign of Iranian Kilo-class submarines or surface patrols that might be operating in the area. The ocean remained still. The only sound in the control room was the soft clicking of keyboards and the steady breathing of the crew. The gravity of the strike was felt by every man and woman on board. To fire cruise missiles at a sovereign capital was an act of total war, a decision made at the highest levels of the United States government and transmitted through a chain of command that ended here in the dark water of the Arabian Sea. There was no room for error. The timing had to be perfect to ensure that the missiles arrived simultaneously, overwhelming the local point defense systems of the Iranian capital. The navigator confirmed the submarine's exact position. They were maintaining a steady course at 5 knots, providing a stable platform for the launch. The depth was adjusted to 30 meters, bringing the top of the vertical launch tubes closer to the surface. The pressure inside the tubes was equalized with the surrounding sea. The commanding officer took a deep breath, the taste of recycled air dry in his throat. He reached for the handset of the internal communication system. His voice was calm, the voice of a man who had trained for this moment for 20 years. He announced the transition to weapons-free status. In the silence that followed, the final interlocks were cleared. The safety keys were turned in unison by the commanding officer and the executive officer. On the display screens, the 12 missile icons turned from amber to a steady pulsing green. The countdown was no longer a matter of minutes, but seconds. The USS Virginia, a shadow in the deep, was about to speak with the voice of 12,000 kilograms of high explosives. 4:35 in the morning, the command center of the USS Virginia. The submarine maintained its depth at exactly 30 meters, a shallow perch for a vessel of its size. The ocean above was a dark, rolling expanse of salt water, masking the lethal intent gathered below the surface. The air in the control room was cool and dry, filtered through advanced scrubbers that removed every trace of human presence. The mission data was now fully uploaded into the internal guidance systems of the 12 Tomahawk cruise missiles. The USS Virginia was a masterpiece of underwater engineering, a silent predator designed by the United States Navy to operate in the most contested waters on the planet. Beneath the black water of the Arabian Sea, the submarine was nearly invisible to the Iranian coastal radar and sonar stations. Its hull was covered in thousands of specially designed anechoic tiles, which were thick slabs of rubberized material that absorbed active sonar waves rather than reflecting them back to an enemy receiver. This stealth allowed the vessel to sit just miles from a hostile coastline, acting as a submerged launch platform that could strike targets deep inland, with zero warning. Inside the weapons compartment, the 12 Tomahawk cruise missile Block V units sat vertically in their launch tubes. Each missile was a sophisticated autonomous aircraft, powered by a small turbofan engine capable of pushing the weapon at high subsonic speeds, for over 1,600 kilometers. The Block V variant was the latest evolution of the system, featuring an improved navigation suite and a communication link that allowed the submarine crew to receive real-time updates from the missile during its flight. The mission planning had been exhaustive. The target was the headquarters of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, a massive complex of concrete and reinforced steel located in the northern sector of Tehran. The primary aim was the Central Command Tower, located at coordinates 35 degrees 41 minutes north, 51 degrees 24 minutes east. To reach this point, the missiles would have to perform a complex series of maneuvers. They were programmed to utilize terrain contour matching, a system that used an internal radar altimeter to compare the ground below with a stored digital map. This would allow the missiles to fly as low as 30 meters above the ground, hugging the contours of the Zagros Mountains to stay below the horizon of Iranian surface-to-air missile batteries. The navigation technicians monitored the final alignment of the inertial platforms. Each missile carried a 1,000-pound high-explosive warhead, specifically designed for hardened targets. The strike package was divided into 3 waves of 4 missiles each. The first wave was timed to hit the main communications arrays and the primary air defense coordination center on the roof of the headquarters. The second and third waves would follow seconds later, focused on the structural supports of the building to ensure a complete collapse of the facility. In the control room, the electronic warfare officer confirmed that the Iranian sensors remained unaware of their presence. The nearby coastal waters were patrolled by fast attack boats, but their simple radar systems could not penetrate the surface to find the USS Virginia. The silence inside the submarine was absolute, broken only by the hum of the cooling fans and the occasional low-volume report from the sonar technicians. The crew had practiced this sequence hundreds of times in simulators, but the reality of the mission carried a weight that no training could replicate. The tactical coordinator checked the time. It was now 4:42 in the morning. The flight time to Tehran was calculated at approximately 1 hour and 10 minutes. If the launch occurred on schedule, the missiles would arrive over the capital city just as the first light of dawn touched the mountain peaks. This timing was intentional, designed to catch the headquarters staff during the transition between the night and day shifts, maximizing the disruption to the Iranian command structure. The commanding officer leaned over the shoulder of the weapons officer, verifying the final launch sequence. Every interlock was green. The submarine's position was verified to within centimeters using the encrypted satellite link. The missiles were warm and ready, their internal gyroscopes spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute. The plan was a surgical strike of unprecedented scale, a demonstration of American reach that required no forward air bases or carrier groups in the immediate vicinity. The atmosphere in the room was one of cold, clinical professionalism. There was no excitement, only the steady execution of a complex technical task. The smell of the sea was gone, replaced by the scent of warm electronics and the sterile environment of a modern warship. The final confirmation from Pacific Command flashed on the primary screen. The mission was a go. The 12 missiles were no longer just pieces of hardware. They were the focused will of a superpower. contained within 12 tubes of pressurized steel. 4:45 in the morning. The Arabian Sea. The commanding officer of the USS Virginia spoke the final authorization codes into the secure internal line, his voice steady and devoid of hesitation. In the control room, the weapons officer shifted a physical safety guard and depressed the firing trigger. This single action initiated a complex sequence of high-pressure events that had been refined over decades of American naval engineering. Deep within the midship section of the submarine, the vertical launch system responded instantly to the electronic command. A high-pressure gas generator at the base of the first launch tube ignited, creating a massive volume of expanding gas that acted as a piston. The 4-ton Tomahawk cruise missile was punched upward, ejected from the submarine at a speed of 40 meters per second. The water directly above the hull erupted in a violent, massive circle of white bubbles and churning foam as the displaced ocean fought to fill the void. Within the submarine, the crew felt a heavy, rhythmic thud that vibrated through the steel deck plates, a physical reminder of the immense forces being unleashed just meters away from their stations. The first missile broke the surface of the Arabian Sea with a spectacular explosion of spray. The protective nose cap was blown clear by small explosive bolts, spinning away into the dark water. The air above the sea was cold and thick with salt, but it was suddenly torn apart by a sound that could be heard for miles. Exactly 1 second after clearing the surface, the solid fuel rocket booster at the tail of the missile ignited. A pillar of brilliant orange fire and dense white smoke punched through the pre-dawn darkness, illuminating the rolling waves in a harsh, flickering light. The Tomahawk cruise missile climbed steeply into the sky, its 4 grid fins at the rear deploying instantly to provide aerodynamic stability. The heat from the booster was intense, momentarily scorching the surface of the water as the weapon clawed for altitude. As the missile reached 200 meters, the spent rocket booster was jettisoned. The heavy steel casing fell away, tumbling back toward the ocean and vanishing beneath the waves with a heavy splash. In the sudden silence following the booster burnout, the missile's internal turbofan engine spun up to its full operating speed of 15,000 revolutions per minute. The high-pitched whine of the engine echoed across the empty water as the air intake on the belly of the missile opened. 2 narrow wings pivoted out from the fuselage, with a sharp metallic snap, locking into place to provide the necessary lift for long-range flight. The missile leveled off at a cruising altitude of 60 meters, its guidance computer now fully in control of the mission. The launch continued in a rapid, disciplined rhythm. Every 10 seconds, another gas expansion thudded through the hull of the USS Virginia, followed by the roar of another rocket booster igniting on the surface. The 12 missiles were launched in 3 distinct cells of 4. The night sky was soon crisscrossed by 12 white columns of smoke, each marking the path of a weapon heading north toward the Iranian coastline. The smell of burnt chemical propellant and hot metal hung heavily over the water, a sharp and acrid reminder of the strike. Inside the submarine, the technical team watched the telemetry data on their screens. Each Tomahawk cruise missile Block V was reporting a healthy status. The weapons were now accelerating to 880 kilometers per hour. Their low-altitude flight path designed to keep them beneath the detection threshold of any coastal radar stations. They flew in a loose, staggered formation, a pack of mechanical predators moving with total synchronization. The transition from the pressurized launch tube to the open atmosphere was the most vulnerable part of the mission, and it had been executed with professional perfection. The USS Virginia remained submerged, its presence still undetected by the surface patrols that were likely miles away. The submarine had completed the first phase of its objective. It had projected the power of the United States Navy from the silent depths into the open sky. The missiles were now 5 miles from the launch point and moving faster with every passing second. They were no longer under the direct control of the sailors below the waves. They were guided by a combination of satellite signals and internal inertial platforms, heading for the first waypoint at the edge of the Iranian mainland. The mission was now a matter of mathematics and physics. 12,000 pounds of high explosives were screaming across the Arabian Sea, and the window for any Iranian response was closing with terrifying speed. 5 in the morning. the northern edge of the Arabian Sea and the Iranian coastline. The 12 Tomahawk cruise missiles crossed the shoreline at a speed of 880 kilometers per hour. They maintained a radar-evading altitude of only 30 meters, their bellies nearly skimming the crests of the breaking waves before transitioning over the coastal salt flats. The air here was heavy, with the scent of brine and the cooling earth of the desert. To any observer on the ground, the missiles would have appeared only as a series of low, blurred shapes accompanied by a sudden, ear-splitting shriek that vanished. It could be processed. The missiles were now entering the second and most difficult phase of their journey. The navigation of the Zagros Mountains. This rugged mountain range, with peaks rising over 4,000 meters, served as a natural wall protecting the Iranian heartland. To bypass this obstacle, the weapons utilized their terrain contour matching systems. Every few milliseconds, the internal radar, the ground below, comparing the elevation changes to a high-resolution digital map stored in its memory. As the first ridges appeared, the missiles pulled into a coordinated climb, hugging the rocky slopes with terrifying precision. They banked through narrow mountain passes and dived into deep, shadowed valleys, staying below the line of sight of the high-altitude radar installations located on the peaks. The flight was a masterpiece of autonomous navigation. The missiles moved through the cold mountain air, the white condensation trails, from their turbofan engines dissipating quickly in the thin, dry atmosphere. Inside the USS Virginia, 300 miles to the south, the mission controllers monitored the progress through a narrow-band satellite link. The screen displayed 12 blue icons, moving steadily across a three-dimensional map of Iran. There were no voices in the control room now, only the rhythmic ping of the data updates. The technical crew knew that as long as the icons remained blue, the missiles were on track. If one turned red, it meant a mechanical failure or a successful intercept. So far, the map was a solid line of blue. The missiles were now 300 kilometers from Tehran. They had successfully navigated the most treacherous part of the terrain and were entering the central plateau. Here, the ground leveled out, allowing the weapons to drop back down to their minimum cruising altitude. The speed remained constant, a relentless subsonic push that allowed no time for the Iranian air defense network to coordinate a response. The flight path was designed to approach the capital from the north, an unexpected direction that would bypass the heaviest concentrations of surface-to-air missiles stationed to the south and west. The environmental sensors on the missiles recorded a drop in temperature as they moved further north. The smell of the sea was long gone, replaced by the scent of cold stone and the thin, sharp air of the high plateau. The weapons were now entering the final waypoint before their terminal descent. In 20 minutes, they would be over the outskirts of Tehran. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard headquarters sat waiting, unaware that 12,000 pounds of high explosives were currently navigating the landscape at the speed of a jetliner. The silent launch, the low-altitude coastal crossing, and the precision mountain navigation was all leading to a single point in time. The technical superiority of the USS Virginia and her payload was about to be measured in the structural integrity of a building in the center of a hostile capital. The guidance computers checked the final coordinates one last time. The target was locked. Latitude 35 degrees 41 minutes north, longitude 51 degrees 24 minutes east. The missiles began a slight course correction, spreading out into a wider formation to ensure they would hit the target from multiple angles simultaneously. The final approach was beginning. 5:55 in the morning. The northern outskirts of Tehran. The first wave of 4 Tomahawk cruise missiles surged over the final ridgeline of the Zagros Mountains, descending into the urban basin of the Iranian capital. The city was a sprawling carpet of dim yellow lights, under a sky that was just beginning to turn a bruised, pre-dawn purple. The missiles did not slow down. Their internal computers switched to the terminal guidance phase, utilizing the digital scene matching area correlator. An internal camera scanned the ground, comparing the physical structures of the city to stored satellite imagery, locking onto the massive, rectangular silhouette of the Revolutionary Guard headquarters. The air over Tehran was cold and still, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke and exhaust. This piece was shattered in an instant, as the 4 missiles accelerated for their final plunge. Inside the headquarters, the night shift security detail was preparing for the morning rotation. The primary air defense radar at the Mehrabad airport had only just registered a faint, fast-moving contact. But before an alarm could be sounded, the strike began. The lead missile executed a violent pop-up maneuver, climbing 300 meters into the air, before rolling inverted and diving straight down toward the roof of the main command tower. The trigger was pulled by the internal logic of the weapon. The missile shrieked through the air, a blur of gray steel and a high-pitched turbofan whine that lasted only a fraction of a second. The heat of the engine left a momentary distortion in the cold morning air as the weapon targeted the primary satellite and communications array located on the roof. The 1,000-pound high-explosive warhead punched straight through the reinforced concrete roof, the kinetic energy of the impact carrying the missile 2 floors deep into the building before the fuse detonated. A massive fireball erupted from the center of the tower, bleaching the surrounding city streets in a blinding white light. The pressure wave was so intense, it blew out every window within a 4-block radius, sending millions of shards of glass raining down like lethal snow. The entire top 3 floors of the headquarters were vaporized instantly, replaced by a churning column of black smoke and orange flame that rose 50 meters into the sky. The defenders inside the complex reacted with blind, frantic chaos. Soldiers and guards, who had been standing at the main gate, were thrown off their feet by the shockwave, their eardrums ruptured by the sheer volume of the detonation. Emergency sirens began to wail across the city, a rising and falling scream that competed with the roar of the fire. Guards in the lower levels scrambled for the exits, their boots slipping on the debris of collapsed ceilings. On the roof of a nearby government building, a point defense gunner frantically rotated his weapon toward the sky, but he was looking for aircraft, not the low-flying missiles that were still coming. The immediate aftermath was a scene of total structural devastation. The main communications tower had been severed. At its base, the twisted steel frame leaning precariously over the street below. Thick, acrid black smoke boiled out of the jagged hole in the roof, lit from beneath by the intense chemical fire of the burning missile propellant. The sound of metal groaning under the heat of 1,000 degrees filled the air, punctuated by the secondary explosions of stored ammunition within the security offices. The nerve center of the Revolutionary Guard had been decapitated in less than 3 seconds. The first wave had achieved its primary objective, the total destruction of the headquarters' ability to communicate with the rest of the nation. The regional command nodes were now blind, and the leadership inside the building was either dead or buried under hundreds of tons of pulverized concrete. At least 45 personnel were killed in the initial impact, with dozens more trapped in the burning upper levels. But the strike was not over. 3 miles to the north, the second wave of 4 missiles was already leveling out for its own terminal run. The first fireball served as a beacon, marking the target for the weapons that were now seconds away from impact. The USS Virginia had delivered the first blow, and the second was designed 5:56 in the morning. Central Tehran. The second wave of 4 Tomahawk cruise missiles arrived over the target exactly 60 seconds after the first. The air around the Iranian Revolutionary Guard headquarters was now a swirling vortex of heat, gray concrete dust, and the smell of burning plastic. The first fireball had already weakened the structural integrity of the main tower, and the second wave was programmed to exploit those fractures. These missiles did not pop up. They stayed low, screaming through the canyons of the surrounding office buildings at 900 kilometers per hour. The 5th and 6th missiles dived simultaneously into the base of the tower. They punched through the heavy reinforced concrete of the ground floor, driving deep into the structural load-bearing columns. The warheads detonated with a synchronized roar that sent a massive ground-shaking tremor through the entire city block. The blast wave threw cars 50 meters into the air and shattered the foundations of the adjacent parking garage. Inside the headquarters, the physics of the building simply gave up. 6 tons of steel and 5,000 tons of concrete were suddenly unsupported. The main tower began to lean, then accelerated into a catastrophic pancake collapse. Floors slammed into floors, creating a thunderous sound that cracked eardrums for a mile. A wall of pulverized stone and white dust erupted outward, swallowing the surrounding streets and burying the Iranian security forces who were trying to organize a rescue. The heat blast from the secondary explosions washed across the debris, igniting anything that remained flammable. The 7th and 8th missiles targeted the underground bunker entrances located 50 meters to the east of the main site. These missiles were fitted with delayed action fuses. They drove straight into the reinforced steel blast doors, the kinetic force of the impact, severing the hinges before the warheads erupted. The internal pressure of the detonations was trapped within the concrete tunnels, compressing the air until it reached temperatures of 2,000 degrees. The fire roared through the ventilation shafts, venting out of the ground, in high-velocity plumes of orange flame that reached 30 meters into the sky. The reaction from the surviving defenders was a mix of terror and total paralysis. Nine surface-to-air missiles located 5 miles to the south finally launched. But their radar was confused by the dense smoke and the low-altitude clutter of the city. The missiles spiraled uselessly into the sky before self-destructing. On the ground, the sound of metal tearing and concrete grinding continued as the last of the headquarters tower settled into a pile of smoking rubble 3 stories high. The immediate aftermath was a scene of total erasure. Where a 10-story fortress of Iranian military power had stood 60 seconds ago, there was now only a jagged mountain of smoking ruins. The smell of burning diesel and pulverized stone was overpowering, thick enough to choke the survivors who were crawling from the perimeter. Every communication line to the facility was dead. The primary command staff, the high-level encryption servers, and the regional operations maps had been obliterated. Across the street, the third wave of 4 missiles was already visible against the brightening sky. They were not aiming for the ruins of the tower. Their targets were the secondary support buildings and the motor pool, where the Guard's rapid response vehicles were stationed. The USS Virginia was not just destroying a building, it was methodically deleting an entire military capability from the center of Tehran. 6 in the morning. The skies over Tehran and the surrounding air bases. The city was now fully awake, though paralyzed by the massive pillars of black smoke rising from the center of the capital. 10 miles to the west, at Mehrabad Air Base, the sirens were screaming in a different tone. The Iranian Air Force was scrambling to respond to a strike they had never seen coming. Pilots ran across the tarmac, the air thick with the smell of kerosene and the roar of aging jet engines being forced into life. Within minutes, 4 Phantom interceptors and 2 MiG-29 fighters were hurtling down the runways, their afterburners twin stabs of blue-white fire against the dawn. The Iranian air defense network was in a state of total, lethal confusion. The destruction of the Revolutionary Guard headquarters had severed the primary coordination link between the long-range radar sites and the local surface-to-air missile batteries. On radar screens across the province, operators saw a chaotic mess of ghost contacts, bird flocks, and the smoke plumes from the impact site. The air above the city was a graveyard of electronic signals. As the third wave of 4 Tomahawk cruise missiles closed in on the secondary targets, the Iranian point defense systems finally opened fire. HQ-9 and Tor-M1 missile batteries began launching blindly into the smoke. The sky was suddenly crisscrossed by the white trails of defensive missiles and the bright green tracers of 23mm anti-aircraft guns. The sound was a continuous, rolling thunder that shook the windows of every apartment in northern Tehran. One of the approaching Tomahawks was clipped by a burst of anti-aircraft fire. The missile's left wing was shredded, sending the weapon into a violent roll. It slammed into an empty government warehouse 2 miles short of the target, erupting in a fireball that sent a shockwave through the industrial district. But the remaining 3 missiles were undeterred. They adjusted their paths with mechanical coldness, flying through the wall of lead and fire. The 7th and 8th missiles struck the Revolutionary Guard motor pool and the secondary intelligence annex simultaneously. The motor pool, filled with fuel trucks and armored transport vehicles, became a lake of fire. The high-explosive warheads ignited the stored fuel, creating a secondary blast that sent a mushroom cloud of oily black smoke 200 meters into the air. The intelligence annex, a 4-story brick and concrete building, simply folded inward. The sound of the collapse was a deep, guttural roar that signaled the end of the offensive phase of the mission. In the air, the Iranian pilots were frantic. They circled the city at 10,000 feet, their radars searching for the ghosts that had leveled the most secure building in the country. They found nothing. The USS Virginia had launched its payload and remained silent, hundreds of miles away. The Tomahawks were already gone, their missions completed in a series of white-hot flashes. There were no American aircraft to intercept, no carriers to counterattack. The Iranian jets were chasing the wind over a city that was already burning. The smell in the cockpit of the lead MiG-29 was the smell of ozone and sweat. The pilot looked down at the smoking crater where the heart of his military's command structure had been. He banked his aircraft hard to the west, searching for any sign of a retreat. But the sky was empty. The strike had been a ghost operation. Executed with the clinical precision of a machine, down in the streets, the chaos was transitioning into a grim realization. The Revolutionary Guard, the most feared organization in the nation, had been blinded and broken in the span of 15 minutes. The ambulances were now arriving in the hundreds, their blue lights flickering through the thick dust. The Iranian response had been too little and too late. The technical superiority of the United States Navy had not just hit a target, it had demonstrated that distance and concrete were no longer any protection at all. 6:15 in the morning, a secure facility at the National Reconnaissance Office in Chantilly, Virginia. High above the Earth, a KH-11 Kennan reconnaissance satellite adjusted its optical sensors as it passed over the meridian of Tehran. The morning sun was now high, enough to cast long, sharp shadows across the Iranian plateau, providing the perfect contrast for battle damage assessment. On the high-resolution monitors in the United States, the thermal signatures of the city began to resolve into a crystalline, terrifying clarity. The air in the darkened room was quiet, the only sound being the hum of the cooling systems and the soft, rapid clicking of analysts' mice. The image of northern Tehran was dominated by a massive, irregular plume of dark gray smoke that drifted slowly toward the southeast. As the digital zoom enhanced the frame, the extent of the destruction became undeniable. The site where the Iranian Revolutionary Guard headquarters had stood was no longer a building. It was a jagged, smoking crater of pulverized stone and twisted steel. The thermal sensors registered heat signatures in excess of 800 degrees Celsius at the center of the debris, indicating that the fires from the ruptured fuel lines and missile propellant were still burning with intense ferocity. The lead analyst, a commander in the United States Navy, utilized a digital stylus to circle the key points of the complex. The main command tower had undergone a total structural failure. It had collapsed into its own footprint, a phenomenon known as pancaking, which meant that any personnel in the upper or middle floors had almost zero chance of survival. The satellite imagery confirmed that the primary satellite uplink dishes and the hardened communications masts had been vaporized. In the first wave, the coordination hub for the entire regional network was gone. Target Alpha is neutralized, the commander stated, his voice flat and professional. Confirmed total collapse of the primary structure. Secondary targets Beta and Gamma, the motor pool and intelligence annex, are showing 70% and 90% destruction respectively. The subterranean entrances have been successfully breached. We are seeing significant thermal venting from the ventilation shafts, indicating internal fire spread throughout the bunker levels. The strategic impact was being calculated in real time. By destroying this specific node, the United States had effectively severed the head from the body of the Iranian military's unconventional warfare apparatus. The encrypted orders that usually flowed from this building to proxies across the Middle East had ceased. On the screens, the analysts watched as Iranian emergency vehicles swarmed the site, their movements frantic and uncoordinated. Without the central command, the local authorities were struggling to manage the perimeter or even begin a recovery effort. The casualty estimates were updated based on the known staffing levels for a morning shift change. Initial projections suggested that between 200 and 250 high-level personnel, including several senior officers of the Revolutionary Guard, had been in the building at the time of decapitating impact. The precision of the Tomahawk cruise missiles had ensured that while the headquarters was erased, the civilian apartment blocks just 300 meters away remained largely intact, though their windows had been shattered by the overpressure. In the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs of Staff received the final briefing. The operation, executed by a single Virginia-class submarine, had achieved a strategic result that would normally have required an entire carrier air wing and a week of sustained bombing. The Ghost Strike had proven the viability of the American undersea deterrent. There was no triumphalism in the turret room, only the cold satisfaction of a plan executed with technical perfection. The mission was not just a military victory, it was a psychological blow. The Iranian leadership now had to contend with the reality that their most secure facilities were vulnerable to a weapon they could not track, launched from a ship they could not see. The smell of the sea was thousands of miles away from the smoke of Tehran, but the connection between the two was now written in the rubble of the city. 7:30 in the morning. The Arabian Sea, 300 miles south of the Iranian coastline, the USS Virginia maintained its steady, silent patrol at a depth of 60 meters. Inside the hull, the tension that had gripped the control room for the last 3 hours had transitioned into a quiet, focused calm. The mission was complete. The 12 vertical launch tubes, which had been filled with the fire and pressure of the Tomahawk cruise missiles, were now empty and flooded with the cold, dark water of the Indian Ocean. The submarine remained a ghost in the deep, its presence still undetected by any surface or subsurface sensors. The commanding officer sat in his chair, watching the passive sonar waterfall displays. The acoustic signature of the ocean was normal, the rhythmic clicking of shrimp, the low-frequency groan of distant merchant ships, and the steady rush of the current against the hull. There were no high-speed propeller sounds that would indicate an incoming torpedo or a pursuing Iranian frigate. The Ghost Strike had been perfectly executed. The weapons had reached their destination, and the platform that delivered them had already vanished back into the vast, lightless interior of the sea. The air inside the submarine remained sterile and recycled, carrying only the faint scent of electronics and the metallic tang of the hull. For the crew, life was returning to the disciplined routine of a long-duration deployment. The reactor technicians monitored the steady output of the S9G power plant. The culinary specialists prepared the next meal in the galley, and the off-watch sailors climbed into their bunks, the vibration of the ship's quiet drive system acting as a familiar lullaby. They had just altered the course of history, but for the next few weeks, their world would be defined by the 4-inch steel walls and the glowing screens of their stations. A final, encrypted transmission was received through the towed buoy antenna. It was a short burst of data from Pacific Command, confirming the successful battle damage assessment. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard headquarters had been officially declared destroyed. The message contained no praise, only a new set of patrol coordinates, and a directive to maintain total MCON electronic conditions silence. The USS Virginia was to remain on station, a hidden insurance policy against any further escalation. The strategic map of the Middle East had been fundamentally reshaped by 12,000 pounds of high explosives and the precision of American naval engineering. In Tehran, the smoke would continue to rise for days, a visible monument to the reach of the United States Navy. In the Arabian Sea, there was only the endless, rolling blue of the water and the silence of the deep. The submarine banked slightly to the west, its propeller wash leaving a trail of tiny bubbles that vanished almost instantly in the dark. The commanding officer looked at the digital clock on the bulkhead. It was 7:45 in the morning. He stood up, adjusted his cover, and prepared to head to the wardroom. The mission was over, the target was gone, and the USS Virginia was moving on to the next sector. The sea kept its secrets, and today, it kept one more.